Today's video is brought to you by Squarespace. You've heard me talk about them before, and honestly, if you're making a website in 2022 without Squarespace, then you must be insane, because it has all of the tools you need in one place. And not only that, that place is super easy to navigate and make a website on. All you need to do is head to squarespace.com. From there, the next step, for those of you who want to be quick, is to browse through their extensive selection of templates. And then, they'll ask you questions like, what is your site about? And you'll say something like photography, and they'll be like, look, we have these templates that are perfect for photographers. You're like, oh, brilliant, thank you, Squarespace. But it's not just photographers. There's tons of different options. They then ask you about your goals, and you could say something like, I don't know, I want to collect donations. For our photographer example, maybe you want to sell services. And then they find the best matching templates for you. You pick one that you like, you set it up, you change out some pictures, some texts, and then you're good to go. And of course, Squarespace has all of the basics that you'd expect, like analytics, so you can see what's going on behind the scenes, and blogging features, email newsletters, all of that good stuff. So head to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're all ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/brainfood to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain. And now, today's episode. There are many seemingly universal truths that society has clung to over time about the inherent differences between men and women. Some of which, of course, we now know are a load of crap, even in the general case, let alone in the specific ones where there are exceptions to every rule. But that's not to say there aren't many genuine differences, even beyond the most obvious physiological ones. For example, elements of how our brains are wired and develop, and how our different cocktail of hormones could affect things are there as well. The question today is the common trope that men frequently can't see things right in front of their faces actually a thing, or is it just a popular perception that has over time become reinforced by confirmation bias, and there is actually no inherent difference here? It turns out the answer's complicated because, well, the universe rejects simplicity as ever. To begin with, very unhelpfully, there has to date not been a single study that does a deep dive into this specific topic, though there was one paper published in the Canadian Medical Association journal Refrigerator Blindness, Selective Loss of Visual Acuity in Association with Common Foraging Behavior by Andrew McNabb and Mary Bennett, which did cover it. Just very much in a tongue-in-cheek fashion, stating among other things, the case, 3 male offspring aged 9 to 14 years of one of the authors, MB, were observed to experience visual problems profound enough to imply functional blindness. The visual deficit was evident on almost every occasion when any one of the children of this physician went to the refrigerator and opened the door. The acute visual problem encountered was noted to be part of a consistent behavior pattern wherein, a few seconds after the fridge door was opened, a cry would be heard from the affected child of "Mum, where's the milk?" or any other item being sought. Shouted directions as to the location of the object only occasionally led to it becoming visible. Even with calm and constructive maternal encouragement and direction, the desired object typically would remain unseen until the mother physician attended the fridge side and physically identified the precise location of the item. Attempts at patient empowerment through counseling, surely someone of your age can find the, rarely led to success, and diagnostic accusations such as "Are you blind?" appeared to aggravate the condition, possibly through subliminal trauma to the fragile male psyche. Others, such as Dr. Raymond Salter of the Mayo Clinic, notes this phenomenon is noteworthy for those afflicted's inability to locate edibles, condiments in particular, within a reasonable amount of time in the presence of a spouse. And that the symptom in bachelors, like a tree falling in the woods, has no one there to be annoyed by it, but within the confines of a marriage has a progressively corrosive effect on the spousal relationship. So, what's going on here? Well, let's dive into it, shall we? First, a potential contributing factor here may not so much be a difference in brains, though we will get into some potentials on that one in just a bit, but rather a difference in roles. While roles within the home have changed a lot over particularly recent decades, many women are still more or less in charge of maintaining the home, from laundry to grocery shopping and cooking to putting things away and stuff like that. Thus, having both purchased and put the butter away, she knows both that you definitely have butter and exactly where it is without needing to look. And indeed, many times when the men in people's lives can't find something right in front of their face, the women in their lives can call out from another room exactly where it is without using their eyes at all. Thus, in these cases at least, they have a not inconsiderable advantage in locating things that has nothing to do with their vision or the way that their brains work. As one paper on how we recognize things visually, visual attention and eye movements by Kang Chen Chen et al. Notes, studies have shown that the eyes will make fixations to points that are most informative. There are several factors that determine the pattern of fixation. One factor is the person's task or goals. For example, if a person was shown and asked if there is an airplane, the first places they would fixate on will be the sky and the clouds. However, if they were asked if there is anyone on the streets, they will fixate on the sidewalks and the roads first. Thus again, at least part of the difference between men and women here may be centered in this pattern of fixation, with the women often more familiar with where to find something and so better know where to fixate first, even when they aren't totally sure of the exact location. Further, they may, in some cases, also be more familiar with what something might exactly look like, such as brand labeling or the like on an item in the refrigerator. On this note, one researcher, mostly joking about their analysis, noted, "Most controversial is the theory that wives may purposefully trigger refrigerator blindness in susceptible husbands by heckling them with theatrical eye-rolling or sighing, in effect, jinxing their mate's tentative food search. In extreme cases, wives may intentionally hide smaller items behind larger ones and occasionally switch brands, disorientate husbands with unfamiliar labels and container sizes." The aforementioned Dr. Salter of the Mayo Clinic goes on in this tongue-in-cheek manner, stating, "Refrigerator blindness seems to be encoded in our very DNA to keep men dependent on women for the good of the species. Otherwise, males might wander off on their own for a snack and never return to their mate." Going back to putting things away and knowing where they are because of it, the author of this piece even once had his wife, who had been away for almost 4 months for work reasons, after he had searched the house top to bottom and unable to find their children's swimsuits, she simply texted him their exact location immediately upon request. You see, she had put them there the previous autumn. We shall not discuss whether said author had already looked in that location several times, thinking the probable location for said swimsuits, and totally didn't see them right in front of his face each and every time until said wife triply insisted that they were there and would not take "they are not" for an answer. So all this brings us back to whether there is in fact a difference in the way the male and female brain process visual information, and if these differences may be contributing. First, absolutely. There are loads of measurable differences between how men and women perceive things visually. Whether any of that comes to bear here, well, we'll just give you the information and you can discuss in the comments, because again, nobody has specifically done a study looking at this exact refrigerator blindness phenomenon. But let's now talk about some seemingly known differences in the way, in general, men and women see things. First up, colours. It would seem women perceive these more vibrantly than men. As noted in a study, Sex and Vision 2, Color Appearance of Monochromatic Lights by Dr. Israel Abramov et al., there were relatively small but clear and significant differences between males and females in the hue sensations elicited by almost the entire spectrum. In another study, Gender-Based Alternation in Color Perception by Nidhi Jaint et al., they note the task was to match 22 test color strips with 2 shade charts of different colors. Total number of correct answers and total time taken in matching the test color strips with the shade charts was recorded in both the sexes and analyzed. The results of the study showed that overall females gave more correct responses and also took less time than males. Color-wise, also, females gave more correct responses, especially for red and green color. The conclusion states that the females can see more shades of colors than males. Interestingly, in contrast, studies have shown that men are actually better than women in general at perceiving changes in color when combined with a form of motion. From these studies, this appears to be less about inherently being better at color recognition and more about being better at picking up details when rapid movement is involved. On that note, let's now talk about motion. In a study by a team from the University of Washington, Sex Differences in Visual Motion Processing, looking at 250 adult men and women viewing black and white bars on a screen, it was found that while both the men and women studied could correctly determine direction of movement extremely rapidly, the women took on average 50% longer to make this determination. As a brief and interesting aside, those on the autistic spectrum have generally been shown to be even faster than neurotypical brained people at this task. But in any event, as to why these visual differences might be present between men and women, the general hypothesis is that once upon a time, men were the hunters and women were the gatherers. Color distinction, wider field of vision, as women women also seem to have, etc., lend itself to gathering, and increased perception of moving objects is more important for hunting. We see similar things in other predators such as cats and dogs. While discussing our canine friends, dogs have much better perceived vision when something is moving versus when it is standing still, being able to distinguish an object as much as twice as far away if it is moving versus consciously noting it when it is motionless. And for reference on this, while studies vary on how much, dogs do seem to pretty consistently be able to perceive motion much better than humans as well, even though dogs' eyesight is actually not that great overall compared to humans. For instance, poodles are estimated to have around 20/75 vision overall. Noteworthy here as well, color perception doesn't appear to be super important to dogs, and while they do not just see in black and white as many say, they do have a level of color blindness and reduced color perception compared to humans. Specifically, dogs have significantly fewer cones than humans, so scientists estimate that they only see colors at about 1/7 as vibrantly as humans do. Despite this, in studies, dogs are quickly able to learn to distinguish not only grey from various colours, but also to easily distinguish between many shades of colours. Like cats, though, dogs once again are partially colourblind. Speaking of cats and things registering in a predator's mind, they are even more interesting on this front in terms of what they're capable of seeing versus what their brains actually register as important. We'll talk more about why cats, even when offered treats, are so much more difficult to train to verbal commands, and why the problem is actually you and not your cat caring or being dumb in the bonus facts later on. But in terms of vision, and potentially related to the topic at hand, consider a study done in 1915 at the University of Colorado, which seemed to show the cats were colorblind. In it, the experimenters had one jar wrapped in grey paper and another in color paper. If the cat touched the colored jar, they'd get a tiny fish as a reward. 18 months and 100,000 tries later, the cats used in the study had only been approximately 50% successful at pricking the right jar the first time. Clearly, they couldn't see color, right? No, that was wrong. Given cats have both cones and rods, further experiments have been done in more modern times using electrodes monitoring the cat's brain, definitively proving that cats can see colours. So why couldn't they figure out which jar to get the treat they wanted? Well, you might think, just to screw with the researchers, cats are gonna cat. It turns out that even though they can distinguish a variety of shades of colour, their brains just aren't really wired to pay attention to colours as something significant to food acquisition. They just don't notice what's right in front of them, even though they can physically see it. But again, if one spent enough time training a specific cat, you can get them to do so. It just takes an astounding amount of training before the colour registers consciously. For example, the aforementioned fish experiment was redone in the 1960s, and this time it was found that if working with an individual cat long and consistently enough, they would learn to pay attention to the colour. But it took a whopping average of 1,550 tries per cat for them to learn to pick the coloured jar. Once they did, they consistently picked it, as they did indeed want the treat inside. Beyond colour perception not seeming to be as important to predators, going back to motion and how that seems to trigger better object recognition in hunter animals, we'd be remiss not to point out that this idea that predators see moving objects better, or at least how they are perceived in the brain, has been taken to its extreme in the likes of Jurassic Park, in which it's stated that the ultimate predator in the T-Rex can only perceive their prey if you move. This, of course, isn't true and would be terribly inconvenient in terms of constantly running into stationary objects if it was. That said, again, primarily hunter/predatory animals do seem to be able to more quickly or better register in their brains things their eyes see when they are moving, and differentiating colours seems to be not as important. But in any event, going back to humans and the differences between how men and women perceive things visually, Albolina Shikari et al. Sums up in their paper Sex-Related Differences in Vision Are Heterogeneous. Quote, "A practical consequence of these results is that it is important to control for sex in vision research, and that findings of sex differences for cognitive measures using visually based tasks should confirm that their results cannot be explained by baseline sex differences in visual perception." Thus, while we cannot, based on the current state of research, say for sure that any of the differences between the way men and women visually perceive things definitely is making a difference here with supposed male refrigerator blindness, we do do at least know our brains process visual information slightly differently. Again, hypothesized to be thanks to our respective former roles as hunter or gatherer. And coming back to the topic at hand, why, for example, spotting stationary objects in the refrigerator may be more in a women's neurological wheelhouse, given it's more a gathering type task. So now let's talk a little bit about object recognition. It turns out how the brain is wired plays a big role in our ability to recognize objects, even sometimes in bizarre ways in cases of brain damage and the like. But for starters, as noted by G.N. Dutton in the paper Cognitive Vision, Its Disorders and Differential Diagnosis in Adults and Children, knowing where and what things are, our ability to survey a visual scene, locate and recognize an object of interest, move towards it and pick it up, recruits a number of complex cognitive higher visual pathways. Recognition of what is being looked at is brought about by comparing the visual input with the image libraries in the temporal lobes. Damage to the temporal lobes can result in impaired recognition, problems with route finding, and poor visual memory. Both medial temporal lobes participate in both activities, but in the context of focal pathology, face recognition and orientation appears to show right-sided dominance, whereas shape and object recognition and the recognition of text appear to show left-sided dominance. Damage to the temporal lobes can therefore result in a variety of patterns of impaired recognition, with right-sided damage being more likely to cause impaired face recognition, prosopagnosia, and left-sided damage being more likely to cause impaired shape and object recognition. Whatever it's worth, there are some notable differences between the temporal lobes of men and women, and connections among several other subtle differences in our brains that may be contributing. Related to the temporal lobes, as noted in a paper by Sandra Whittleson and co. at McMaster University, women have a much higher density of neurons in parts of their temporal lobes associated with, for example, language comprehension and general processing. Whether differences in temporal lobes and other visual processing differences between men and women may be coming to play here, as you're probably tired of hearing already, more research needs to be done to be sure. But it seems very possible, and at least possible enough to warrant someone doing a proper serious study on so-called male refrigerator blindness. And just as an idea as to how weird this all can get at times in terms of the difference between our eyes' ability to see something versus our brain's ability to consciously register it, consider one study on a woman who had bilateral occipital damage. The issue for this woman is that she literally could not perceive anything that was not moving, and even when moving, her perceptions were not exactly quite like how we might otherwise think. However, after some study and therapy, she ultimately was able to learn to be somewhat independent by moving her head from side to side, or otherwise when sitting to sit in a rocking chair and rock back and forth, thus allowing her to perceive things to an extent that were stationary around her. With no such movement, however, she was completely blind, even though there was nothing wrong with her eyes themselves. This all brings us back to men's apparent inability to see things right in front of their faces at times. Is it actually happening? Well, almost universally, anecdotal evidence seems to point to yes, though of course anecdotal evidence can often be misleading. Studies on the differences in men or women in terms of perceived vision also potentially lend itself to that maybe, such as ones that point to women having better color perception, wider field of vision, and slightly different brain wiring and development in a variety of ways that could potentially lend itself to this, whereas men seemingly slightly more wired to focus on something specific and particularly in motion and ignore, to an extent, other things around. Thus, a stationary object in the refrigerator may not be as quickly perceived by the male as the female, particularly if he's not really focusing and his mind's elsewhere, or at least so the hypothesis goes. That said, all of these differences in studies aren't super strong, with, while women having, for example, better color perception, men still being very good at this from a practical standpoint. And it's not like the ketchup bottle is blending in with the mustard or often white-walled fridge or anything. So maybe contributing to the ability to spot things somewhat, but not as stark a difference perhaps as exasperated women the world over may make it appear. And this perhaps then partially again comes back to our common household roles and the fact that women may well have put the ketchup there in the first place and retrieve it more often in cooking, so have a distinct advantage in spotting it later. But in the end, while there are likely direct practical factors at play that have nothing to do with differences in perception and wiring of the male versus female brain, there does seem to be an awful lot of anecdotal evidence combined with our understanding of how the brain recognizes and perceives things, that it seems a probable hypothesis that this male refrigerator blindness might be a thing and worthy of more direct scientific study on the specific phenomenon, and specifically perhaps looking at whether stationary object recognition among women, in the general case, voice is slightly superior to many men's natural abilities, as seems to be the case. But as there has not yet to date been a study really looking into male refrigerator blindness specifically in an in-depth way, we cannot definitively say for sure at this juncture that it's not just one of those weird little quirks of life where anecdotal accounts and confirmation bias point very strongly to one thing while reality says something different once someone does a deep, controlled dive into the matter. But for now at least, I think I speak for men everywhere when I say thank you, ladies. However you're doing it, your hypothetical superpower in this way is massively appreciated. Keep it up, lest I never find my keys again. And now for a bonus fact. This idea that even though we perceive something our brains may not consciously register, it applies to many facets of our life where our brain tunes out things it deems not worth noticing. Going back to cats, this also seems to be why most cats don't really respond to human music or to our words without significant training. You see, it turns out many animal studies show that animals tend to respond more to sounds within their own vocal range as well as rhythms that are relative to their resting heart rates. On this note, researchers at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, led by psychology professor Charles Snowden, decided to see what would happen if they made cat music, essentially music that was tuned to center in the frequency ranges and tempos cats most pay attention to. In this case, as cats' vocal range is about 1 octave higher than a human's, they had composer Professor David T create music in this range. As for the tempo, they went with approximately the average rate a cat purrs at, as well as a separate piece of cat music with a tempo equivalent to that of a kitten suckling. And it turns out when playing this music to 47 cats in the study compared to playing 2 different classical music pieces, the cats did indeed react significantly more positively and pay more attention to the cat music, whereas the human classical music garnered fewer positive responses and reactions, and even those that did react positively to the music took approximately an additional minute to seem to notice it at all. As for the cat music, while not every cat responded, the ones that did tended towards a positive response in the form of purring and sometimes even rubbing up against the speaker playing the music. This may, again, help explain why it takes so much longer to train a cat to obey verbal commands, even when offering a food reward, and why cats seem to respond better to very high-pitched, rapid cadence, kitty 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 type verbiage, than more normal human speech vocalization. Thus, while more studies would need to be conducted to test the hypothesis, it may be when talking about verbal commands that cats aren't just being dicks as they appear, but rather you're not speaking in tones and at tempos that their brains naturally, consciously pay attention to without significant training. And if you're now wondering, dogs also mimic this, just their vocal ranges and heart rates are closer to that of a human. In fact, it's hypothesized by the researchers of the University of Wisconsin-Madison study that this may be why different dogs respond slightly differently to different types of human music, given that different breeds of dogs have different vocal frequency ranges and resting heart rates. If you're curious, breeds like the Labrador have some of the closest vocal ranges and heart rates to humans, with our music likewise generally centered around our vocal ranges and the tempo of our heart rate. Or perhaps being why dogs are much more inclined to not just respond to our music in various ways, but also learn verbal commands much easier than our feline roommates.